my channel. So today we are going to talk about APIs because as we know that it's very crucial for modern applications, backend jobs, and cross-platform systems, and it's very important to understand basic fundamentals of API. So today's video is more focused on talking about the fundamentals of API and specifically about the REST API. We have also covered an example from a open source application called WordPress to give you a little idea about how it is done. So in case you want more detailed video, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment, and I'll be happy to make detailed video about a specific topic. So to understand it better, let's take an example. So I'll assume that you know what is front end, what is back end. So any application, mobile application or website you are interacting with, we will consider that as a front end, and all the processing and the data that happens at the back end is essentially back end. Now just think about a scenario where you are accessing a website and you enter your username and password. When you do that, what essentially happens, a request is generated, right, based on the username and password you entered, and when you click on button, that request is generated and sent to the backend. Now what essentially backend will do, backend will take the information provided from the front end and it will process based on the request you have made. In case of login, it will check whether the login is authentic or not, and based on the processing, the response will be returned back to the front end, and then front end will decide what information should be shown to the user, right? So this complete process that is happening, the middle layer, is the work of API. So what is the meaning of API? That is application programming interface. Let's break it down. So what do you understand by application? Application refers to any software with a distinct function. This could be a web application, mobile app, desktop software, or any other type of software application. The next thing that comes is programming. Programming signifies that the interface is used by the software developers to interact with other software. It involves writing code to make sure of the interface provided. And what is interface? Interface is a point of interaction between two entities. In the context of APIs, it is the means through which different software applications communicate with each other. An interface exposes certain functionalities and allow other softwares to interact with it using a predefined set of rules. To all in all, to summarize, application एक middle layer है which is making sure, which is taking care of communicating information between front end and back end. आपने जब एक रिक्वेस्ट किया तो API उस रिक्वेस्ट को कैरी करता है बैकएंड के पास, बैकएंड उस रिक्वेस्ट को कंज्यूम करता है, प्रोसेस करता है, रिस्पॉन्स देता है, और वो जो रिस्पॉन्स है वो API वापस फ्रंट एंड को सर्व करता है. Okay, in the previous example, we just talked about one system sending request and getting a response back. API is not confined to it. API can, as we know, can programmatically be called, so it can talk between two different independent systems as well. एक example लेके चलते हैं. A e-commerce application and a payment gateway. Suppose you have a e-commerce application and you use, for example, a Razorpay payment gateway for making payments or receiving payments. So what essentially happens? जब आप वो integration करते हो ना, that integration is essentially the API is talking to each other. How? Let's say आपके एक e-commerce application है, यूजर आया, यूजर ने एक प्रोडक्ट ऐड किया, चेकआउट किया. Now the cost is, let's say, 100 rupees and 50 पैसा. So अब क्या करना है आपको? अब आपका सिस्टम क्या करेगा? It will make a request to the payment gateway through an API that payment gateway gave you access to with a specific authorization that you can make a request, and when you make a request, I'll initiate a payment request to the customer. तो आपका जैसे ही चेकआउट हुआ, आपकी एक रिक्वेस्ट गई पेमेंट गेटवे को, इन फॉर एग्जांपल रेजर पे ने एक पेज खोल दिया कस्टमर के लिए, कस्टमर ने वहाँ पे पेमेंट कर दी, और पेमेंट के होते ही आपके पास एक API का रिस्पॉन्स आया जिससे आपको पता चला कि वो पेमेंट सक्सेसफुल हो गई है. बेस्ड ऑन दैट रिस्पॉन्स
यू टुक का एक्शन कि मैंने ऑर्डर कंफर्म कर दिया. फॉर एग्जांपल पेमेंट फेल हो गई तो रिस्पॉन्स आपको नेगेटिव आएगा. जो भी रिस्पॉन्स कोड के अकॉर्डिंगली आपने अपनी वेबसाइट में मैनेजमेंट किया होगा, बेस्ड ऑन दैट यू विल टेक next action, right? So this is how APIs are talking to different systems, and that is why testing the APIs is very important, becoming very important. And so there are major areas that we cover when we test API. One is functionality validation. So essentially, UI is just sending data, receiving data, parsing it, and rendering to the user. But essentially, where the actual magic is happening is behind the scenes. So if you test the API, your functionality is tested. You know, Data accuracy. It ensures the data sent and received by the API is accurate and correctly processed. Reliability, right? So if your APIs are consistent under different conditions, they are more reliable. If you test APIs under different scenarios, you can always say, they are more stable and robust. Security is another very major area. Data protection, right? API testing helps identify security vulnerabilities that could expose sensitive data. I'll give you an example. Authentication and authorization are two different things, right? What if you have you have hidden a web page from a user who is not authorized, but the same page can be accessed through API? That's a threat. So while testing APIs, we can always check those kind of issues. Performance. If APIs are not performing well over a period of time and the user increase, you know the things will become a problem, right? Your website response time will be slow. So if you can test it early, you will have a more happy users coming to your website, right? Integration, as we have already talked about it. APIs are normally a bridge between different systems, and this integration always helps us check the dependency management between the two, between the multiple systems. And since APIs, we don't need to wait for UI to be developed to test APIs, so you can always detect defects early, and that will essentially save the cost.
At a high level, so let's now understand different type of APIs that are available. So there are two types of APIs available. One is REST, which is representational state transfer. So let's first understand what does that mean. So from the word representational, it means that the server provides different ways of representing the resource data, right? That it manages. For example, a server might represent a user as JSON data or XML data. The second word is state. This refers to the current status of or state of a resource at any given time. When you request data from the server, you are getting the current state of that data, right? And another word, the next word is transfer. This means that the state of the resource is transferred between the server and the client, where the client is your application and where it is happening over a network. So REST is a way to structure communication between a client and a server, where server sends the current state of resources in different representations to the client, typically using standard HTTP methods like get, post, put, and delete. We will go through them in detail as we move forward, right? So the next type of APIs that are available are the SOAP APIs. So essentially, what is a SOAP API? It is Simple Object Access Protocol. So let's break it down to understand it better. Simple. Despite the complexity of specifications, the name suggests that the protocol aims to simplify communication between applications by providing a standard way to structure message. Object SOAP is designed to handle and communicate complex data structure, often referred to as an object in programming, which can include various types of data and their relationships. Access SOAP provides a way to access services and data remotely, enabling different systems to communicate and share resources. Protocol. It is a set of rules or guidelines that define how data should be exchanged between systems, right? So SOAP follows a strict and formal protocol, usually over HTTP, to ensure reliable communication. In simpler terms, SOAP is a protocol that allows applications to exchange structured information in a standardized way, typically using XML to format the data. It enables different systems to interact with each other over a network, following strict rules to ensure the information is correctly understood and processed. We will go through them in details as we move forward. Through some key differences between the two, right? So the first difference is the message format. Normally, when you work with REST APIs, you will be interacting with JSON, XML, HTML, plain text. But in case of SOAP, it will be always XML, right? The next thing is state. In case of REST, it is stateless, and in SOAP, it can be stateful. So let's understand this particular difference because it is very critical. So stateless is a situation where each request from a client to server is independent. The server does not remember anything about the client from previous request, right? So imagine you go to a library, every time you visit, you fill out a new form with all your details because the library does not remember you from the last visit. Benefit, everything is independent. It's easier to scale because every request is treated as a new one, right? But in case of stateful, the server remembers the client's previous interactions and can use the information in subsequent request. So imagine you go to a gym, the gym knows your workout history and can suggest a routine based on what you did last time because it keeps a record of your activities. Benefits, it allows for more personalized interactions but can be more complex to manage because server needs to keep track of the client state. So in context of APIs, in case of stateless, each API call is independent. Server does not keep a track of past requests, right? For example, when you search for cats on a search engine, each search is independent. The server doesn't remember your previous searches. I know you will say, we can go to the history and do stuff like that. But from the API perspective, the search being sent to that server, it won't consider what it returned earlier. It will be considered as a new request, right? In case of SOAP, the server can keep track of previous interactions as we discussed. So it is useful for complex operation where context needs to be maintained. An example can be in a banking application when you perform a series of transactions, the server might need to remember your session and transaction history to ensure everything is processed correctly, right? Performance, normally this is better in performance. Now let's talk about security. So the REST APIs normally support HTTPS, which is secure socket layer, which is SSL, and TLS, which is transport layer security. So both of them are cryptographic protocols designed to provide more secure communication over a computer network, right? So when these two are used with HTTP, we call them HTTPS. In case of SOAP, WS security, web service security, is a standard that adds security to SOAP messages. It extends the security model of SOAP by incorporating various security tokens and mechanisms. And use cases can be where REST will be preferred over SOAP and vice versa. It's web services, mobile apps, and microservices for REST. In case of SOAP, enterprises and financial applications is better suited for SOAP APIs. API. How this URL is different from website URL, right? So in case of website, the URL will point to a web page, which is meant to be viewed by humans using a web browser, right? In case of API, it will point to a resource or endpoint on a server, which is meant to be accessed by other softwares or services for data exchange, right? Apart from that, when you hit a web URL, what you get in response is you will either get a HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, or similar things, right? Which will essentially be responsible to render a web page. In case of API, what essentially happens? Normally, the APIs are accessed programmatically via HTTP request, and typically they will return JSON, XML, and other formats, right? So now let's do a further detailed analysis of the URL itself. of the API. So the first part for a API URL is the protocol, that is essentially HTTPS or HTTP. The second part is the base URL, where the URL of the server will be given, right? The next thing that comes is version. This is something, which normally is followed by a lot of big companies. They will put the version, embed the version itself in the API URL itself, and after that they will give the endpoint, right? For example, users, and then you can have query params, and you can put different kind of functionalities here, sort equal to ascending, or the pagination kind of stuff. Everything goes in the query params. And essentially, how do you concatenate them? All the elements, protocol based URL version endpoint, are concatenated using a slash, but the users, I mean the query params, will be concatenated using a question mark. And then if you want multiple query params, you can put an ampersand sign in between. So to consolidate, as a whole, कोई difference नहीं है in the way URL appears to you, right? The similar URL can be created for a web page as well. But जो समझने वाली part है, when you are testing APIs, you should know what is the endpoint, what is the version you are testing, and then you should be aware of what is the query params or the path params that a API supports. Gone through API URLs. Now let's understand what are the different components of a API request. The first one is headers. So whenever you are making an API request, you need to send out some metadata. What is this request all about, right? It can contain what kind of data you are sending. It can contain the authorization information and other information like that. The other component that goes with an API request is the body. So, for example, if you are sending a request to authenticate a user, you need to send username and password. So that information is something which we send in body. So as you know, there are two types of APIs. So everybody, both the APIs may have different standards to take care of sending, standards, different way to send this information. For example, in case of SOAP, this is how the body is sent in form of XML, but in case of REST, it will be a simple JSON or any other format that it supports, right? So path parameter is specific to REST APIs. So path parameters are where we are sending variables in the URL, right? For example, you want detail of a user with ID 1, you will just put a /1 and that will be all. We will go in details, but just wanted to make sure that we go through about components of an API request at high level. So path param and query param are specifically, specific to REST APIs. Although query params can be used in SOAP APIs, but normally they are not used. So path params, as I told you, it's something we pass in the path in the URL itself. But query param is something which we put in key values pair, and we separate it with the question mark. So role equal to admin is something we can send as a query param. Pagination, sorting, those kind of operations are normally even the output format. Those kind of options we pass in query params. What you see here is nothing, just two samples that we have put in place. This is one sample of REST where you are sending, the API, the URL, the header, and the body, and the same thing is for SOAP, right? This is how a overall request for a REST API and SOAP API looks. Okay, now we have talked about differences in two types of API and what actually they are. Now let's talk about specific methods that REST API supports. So what are HTTP methods? They are also known as HTTP verbs. They essentially define the action that can be performed on the resource provided by a web service or API. Each method corresponds to a specific type of request that can be made to the server. So what we are going to show is here the most common methods used in APIs. The first one is get. So get करना है, right? Fetch करना है. Information कुछ, you need some information from the server, you will always use a get method. So read only operations. Post. आपको कुछ एक नया चीज क्रिएट करनी है, essentially for example आपको एक यूजर क्रिएट करना है, then you will use the post method. Put method, this is for updating existing information. For example यूजर ने अपना पासवर्ड चेंज करना है, use put method. पैच मेथड, आपके पास एक रिकॉर्ड में मल्टीपल फील्ड्स हैं, आपको एक स्पेसिफिक फील्ड अपडेट करनी है, यूज पैच मेथड, राइट. डिलीट, द नेम सजेस्ट इटसेल्फ, राइट. नाम से पता चल रहा है, यू हैव टू डिलीट अ रिसोर्स. ऑप्शन, ये बेसिकली एक ऐसा मेथड है विच विल टेल यू व्हाट काइंड ऑफ कम्युनिकेशन ऑप्शंस आर अवेलेबल फॉर द टारगेट रिसोर्स. कि अगर ये आपने इस पे आपने किसी पे ऑप्शन रिक्वेस्ट भेजी, तो वो ये बता देगा ठीक है ऑन दिस रिसोर्स यू कैन परफॉर्म पोस्ट एंड पुट, or you can perform get and delete, right? So that is what options method is. Far we have talked about, requesting server for information, posting a request to the server. The next important thing that we need to understand is whenever you send a request to the server, a response will be received, right? So these responses come in form of codes. So let's have a look at what response codes those there are and what essentially they mean. So anything that comes starting with one will be always a informational response, right? For example, continue, switching protocols, it's kind of a info that is provided to you. Let's say 100, the server has received request header and the client should proceed to send the request body. 101, switching protocols, the requester has asked server to switch protocols and the server is acknowledging that it will do so. Anything started with 200, which you are going to deal with a lot, is success messages. Normally, anything comes with 200 is a success. For example, request has succeeded, 200. Request has succeeded, 201. The request has been fulfilled, which is resulting into creation of a new resource. 202, accepted. Request has been accepted for processing, but the processing has not been completed. 204, 4. This one is interesting. You sent a request, the server successfully processed the request, but it is not returning any content. Now comes uh, this numbers which start with 3. So these are basically redirections. Redirections can be temporary, they can be permanent. For example, 301 means moved permanently. That this resource has been permanently moved to a new URL. 302 found, the resource resides temporarily under a different URL. 304 not modified. There is no need to retransmit the requested resource, it is used for caching purpose only. Next come is 4. I'm sure you have heard about it or seen on the browser itself. Bad request. 400 is bad request. The server could not understand the request due to invalid syntax. 405 unauthorized. The client must authenticate himself or herself to get the requested response. 403 forbidden. 404 not found. 409 conflict. The request conflicts with the current state of the server. Okay, now comes the error codes which start with 5. So these are normally server errors. 500 internal server error. The server has encountered a situation it doesn't know how to handle. 501 not implemented. The requested method is not supported by the server. 502 bad gateway. The server while acting as a gateway or proxy received an invalid response. 503 is service unavailable. Now look, why it is important to understand these error codes, because when you're talking about a website, you're talking about requests being sent to the server and expecting a response against it. These response codes are the medium for the front end to render specific कंडीशंस. फॉर एग्जांपल आपने एक रिक्वेस्ट भेजा ऑथेंटिकेशन का, अब उसका रिस्पॉन्स 200 आ रहा है या उसका रिस्पॉन्स कुछ और आ रहा है, उसके बेस पे यू आर गोइंग टू रेंडर द मैसेज ओके यू हैव बीन सक्सेसफुली ऑथेंटिकेटेड और इनकरेक्ट यूजर नेम एंड पासवर्ड, राइट. सिमिलरली अगर आपने कोई चीज क्रिएट करने की कोशिश की, एक नया यूजर क्रिएट करने की कोशिश करी, 201 ओके ठीक है यार रिसोर्स क्रिएट हो गया. फॉर एग्जाम्पल आपने एक सर्च परफॉर्म करी बट रिजल्ट में आया 204 कि हमने सर्च परफॉर्म करी तो हमें कुछ भी नहीं मिला. So these response codes are very important to understand whenever we are talking about API testing. Showing you here is based on the best practices and commonly accepted conventions for HTTP status code. So these are widely adopted status codes, right? या जो ये आप metrics देख रहे हैं, normally as a good development practice, these are used. So I'm not going to go through each one of them, but you can have a look at it for a better understanding. Okay, so we have talked about REST. In case of SOAP, SOAP uses a different approach and it does not rely on the standard HTTP methods. Instead, it uses specific operations defined in the WSDL, which is Web Service Description Language. And here are the main type of SOAP operations we are going to talk about today. So request response, the client sends a request and the server responds. Usage, standard operations for fetching or updating data. Example can be get user operation fetches user data based on the request. The second method is one way. The client sends a request and there is no response from the server. Usage operations where no response is needed. Example can be a log event operation. Log an event without needing a response or acknowledgement. The third one is solicit response. The server sends a request to the client and the client responds. This is very less used method, right? And I mean this is used only for specific scenarios. You can call it like that, right? An example maybe the server might request updated information from the client, which is really used. Last one is notification. Server sends a message to the client without expecting a response for informing the client. What is the usage for informing the client about events? Example can be notify user operation where we notify the client about a new message. Similar to REST, I am also sharing a table for SOAP. Again, these are based on the best practices and you can pause and take a screenshot for reference. As we had discussed initially, the APIs are called programmatically through some code, through some program. So when you need to test it, you need some kind of API client or a tool where you can, put in the API information and send the response and check it. So there are two popular tools that are normally used for testing, SOAP and REST APIs. The as the name suggests, SOAP UI is something which is very very famous and being used for testing SOAP APIs. And in case of REST APIs, Postman is the tool we normally use. And we are going to show you examples and do some testing using those tools. Okay, so now let's look at an example of how we can test a API. So what we are going to do is we are going to quickly go through what is WordPress. We will have a look at the documentation for one of the APIs. We will create a token. We will create the request in Postman, and we will also have a look at the database and test it against it. Now, the important thing is this is a very, very high level demo that I have prepared. In case you feel you need more details, feel free to leave a comment and I can create another video or you can connect with me personally to understand it better. It's a very high level, so don't expect too much of, getting into details of each and everything because that's something which will take too much time and will not be good from a video perspective, a short video perspective about understanding APIs. We are going to take WordPress. We are going to use WordPress. So WordPress is an open source application which is available for anyone to use for even production environment for commercial use also. And you don't have to pay even a single penny for that. So that's the reason I'm using an open source application. And what essentially it is used for, WordPress is used for essentially, building websites. You can use it for making e-commerce websites. Then you can also, have payment gateways integrated. Obviously, if you're using e-commerce, you need a payment gateway, and it offers, a ton of features that you can use. I won't go into much details about WordPress because this is just example application. I have used it because it's a widely used application and it will give you a fair idea about how a production application is using REST APIs. The reason for taking WordPress as an example is its comprehensive documentation. I'll share the link in the description. So if you go through this documentation, you will know about the implementation of REST API, the organization of REST API in context of WordPress and in general. So for today's example, let's go to references and see यहाँ पे हमारे पास कौन कौन सी APIs available है. If you look at this, this is a complete list of APIs for which documentation is available, and you can use it for practice and anything you like for managing your website essentially. So if you go to users, let's walk through it, right? So यहाँ पे the first thing that comes is schema. So as we have seen, whenever we are making a API request, there is a component called body. तो जो वो body वाला component है, that is where we send, a JSON or XML or whatever. In this case, when we are talking about WordPress, we are going to send JSON. In JSON, you have attributes and values. So this schema is essentially the list of attributes and value that this particular API supports. So important चीज, ये सब चीज जरूरी नहीं कि मैंडेटरी हो, ये भी जरूरी नहीं कि यूजर्स के गेट पोस्ट डिलीट कॉल में सारी की सारी फील्ड्स रिक्वायर्ड हो. सो और यहाँ पे अगर आप देखेंगे तो इफ यू लुक एट दिस आईडी, इट सेज डेटा टाइप इज इंटीजर, राइट, बट इट इज रीड ओनली. सो वी कैन नॉट पास दिस आईडी, हम क्रिएट नहीं कर सकते आईडी, ये रीड ओनली. यूजर नेम के केस में वी कैन क्रिएट इट एंड डेटा टाइप इज स्ट्रिंग एंड सो ऑन. Okay. Now the first, the method that they have listed here is get method. Get method, obviously, जब भी आप get method use करेंगे, you will get list of users in the system. Provided अगर आप एक authentic तरीके से, आप एक authentic user की तरह API से request कर रहे हैं. उसके अंदर आप arguments में क्या क्या भेज सकते हैं? Arguments में आप यहाँ पे query params भेज सकते हैं. So if you look at this, these are all query params. You can send these query params concatenated with your API call by post fixing them. ठीक है. उसके बाद यहाँ पे जो फर्स्ट जो सेकंड चीज आती है वो है क्रिएट अ यूजर. सो एज द नेम सजेस्ट, ये रिक्वेस्ट क्रिएट करने के लिए, सो एसेंशियली इट इज अ पोस्ट रिक्वेस्ट. एंड इफ यू गो थ्रू इट, वी कैन सी यूजर नेम इज रिक्वायर्ड, ईमेल इज रिक्वायर्ड, password is required. Rest of the fields are optional. Okay, let's move forward. हमने retriever user, आप सिर्फ एक path param भेज दीजिए जिसमें user ID भेज दीजिए. You will get details of a specific user. So if you are sending it without ID, you are getting list of user. If you are sending it with ID, you are getting a specific user. Again, update a user, right? Post call. अब ये देखो यहाँ पे, this is interesting. We are using post call for it. So as I told you earlier, so जो एक good coding practices है, but lot of developers don't use put call for update. They will use post call, right? और वो post call करने के लिए then again you have to pass the ID of the user and the field that you want to update. ठीक है. उसके बाद delete में again you have to pass the ID for the user you want to delete. ठीक है. So I'll recommend you to go through this page and understand it better, right? For this demo, what I have done is I have hosted this WordPress on my own server. So if you look at this is the front end of the WordPress. I have hosted it right on my server. I haven't paid anything for it, and this is the back end of this WordPress, right? सो अभी अगर आप देखेंगे तो मेरी डेटाबेस में सिंपल एक यूजर है जिसका नाम हिमांशु है. Now what we are going to do is we are going to do for this demonstration, what first thing we are going to do is we are going to get the list of the users in the database. So we are going to use list users, right? How we have to call it? It says WP v2 users, right? And then I have to concatenate it with my uh, base URL, which is essentially API demo tkhacademy.com along with WP JSON, and then I have to use this part of the API. So to call this, I'm going to use Postman. So this is the web interface of Postman. आप Postman पे simply login करिए, इंटरनेट पे सर्च करके It will ask for a login and automatically आप इस पेज पे redirect हो जाएंगे. So if you click on this link, it will ask for credentials if you are not logged in. If you are logged in, automatically ये interface यहाँ पे launch हो जाएगा. You can also download a desktop copy and do the same things there. Same functionalities are available there also. So अभी हम सबसे पहले क्या करेंगे? We will go click on new and then we will click on HTTP. What kind of request we are making? We are making GET request. So सबसे पहले अभी हम क्या करते हैं? We are going to copy the base URL, right? उसके बाद अब यहाँ पे क्या कॉपी करेंगे? इस डॉक्यूमेंटेशन में जाके जो ये वाला पार्ट है जिसमें मैंने wp-json which is part of the base URL and wp-v2 users which is part of the endpoint. अब मैं यहाँ पे जाके अगर इसको कॉपी कर देता हूँ तो मेरी गेट कॉल ही पूरी हो गई. अब इसमें जो सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट चीज हमें पास करनी होती है वो है ऑथराइजेशन. ऑथराइजेशन पास करने के लिए सो दैट आई कैन टेल द एपीआई आई एम अ वैलिड यूजर. यहाँ पे जहाँ पे आपको बेसिक ऑथेंटिकेशन में वी हैव टू फिल इन यूजर नेम एंड पासवर्ड. दिस पासवर्ड इज नॉट द सेम पासवर्ड जिससे आपने अपना बैकएंड क्रिएट करते हैं. So for this example purpose, what I have done is if I click on my user and go to the bottom, what I can see is it offers me a way to create application password. So application password allows authentication via non-interactive systems such as XML, RPC or REST assured API, REST API. So look, आप जब भी किसी एप्लीकेशन की टेस्टिंग करेंगे, जो उसके क्रेडेंशियल्स हैं, जो उसकी ऑथेंटिकेशन है, वो आपको समझना पड़ेगा कि what kind of authentication works for your website. It can be a basic authentication, it can be a OAuth, and there are hundred other ways to authenticate your APIs. So in case of WordPress, what they have done is they have provided you a UI. You can do the same thing through API also, where if you go to the user account, log in and go to the user account, they will allow you to create a application password. When you create a application password, what it does is it gives you a unique key. So I'm just revoking this. I'll create a new one for you, API demo. I'll click on add application password. So this key is something I can use to authenticate myself. अभी मैं यहाँ गया, मैंने इस की को change कर दिया. My username is Himanshu, right? If I click on send, do I get? Okay. So what you can see is my user details are returned. I mean, this user is returned, right, to me. I can see there is Himanshu written here, name is Himanshu. So what I'll do is to test it out, I'll go and create one more user here, right, to see if anything changes in the API. So मैं यहाँ जाके लिखता हूँ Himanshu1 Himanshu1 at gmail.com and password I'll keep it as is because I don't want to log in. Okay, now I have logged in and let's go and make this call again. So if you go and see, I see Himanshu being returned whose ID is 1 and then I see another record Himanshu 1 whose ID is 4. Why 2 and 3 are missing? Because I created and deleted them earlier. So if you look at this, whatever we created in UI is we are able to see in the API and this is how even the UI is working. So when you go and refresh this page, what essentially happens, एक API call बनती है, get call बनती है, it goes to the backend, backend इस operation को perform करता है और list of users return करता है. So अभी अगर जाके मैं इसी के आगे /4 लिख दूं, so what will happen is I'll get specific user, not two users. So only Himanshu 1 is returned, not the other user. I hope it's clear so far. So now let's move ahead and try to create a user from here. So what I'll do is I'll just change it. Let's make a duplicate of it. You can right click and okay, I thought there is a way to duplicate it, but I cannot see it. No worries. What I'll do is move it to post, right? To create a user, we have to use post method. यहाँ पे मैं जाके I remove this 4 and now what we have to do is we have to send a body. बॉडी में तीन चीजें इंपॉर्टेंट थी. यहाँ पे आप पोस्टमैन में जाके आप बॉडी पे जाएंगे, रॉ पे क्लिक करेंगे एंड यू हैव टू सिलेक्ट जेसन. नाउ यू हैव टू राइट अ जेसन हियर. इन जेसन व्हाट वी नीड इज the documentation to see what are the required fields. So if I I'll go to the create user. मैं यहाँ जाके देख रहा हूँ यूजर नेम इज रिक्वायर्ड एंड ईमेल इज रिक्वायर्ड एंड पासवर्ड इज रिक्वायर्ड. सो व्हाट आई डू इज मैं यहाँ जाके लिखता हूँ यूजर नेम एंड आई पुट एस डबल कोट्स में हिमांशु टू. I put comma, then I'll put email, I'll put himanshu2@gmail.com, and then password, and I'll put himanshu234. And okay, double quotes are missing. I'll put the double quotes, and I close the JSON. JSON is closed. There is some error. Okay, comma is missing. So JSON schema, JSON syntax, we need to know about it or know before we can do it. So what I'll do is I'll click on send. तो अभी क्या हुआ? I get 201 response. It says created. So what that essentially means, if I go and look at this, ID 5 is auto generated. So if I go and look at this and click on refresh, I can see my third user is also created, right? So the most important thing that we need to understand is, you know, whenever we are using an application, what we have done in Postman is happening behind the scenes. If you are able to understand it, how it works, आपने जब भी एक बटन पे क्लिक किया, अगर मैं यहाँ पे जाके भी add new user करता हूँ, so what essentially is going to happen, मैं जब यहाँ पे लिखूंगा add new user में, तो क्या होगा, ये जो भी हमने यहाँ पे JSON बनाया है, वो JSON इस फ्रंट एंड से बन के एक एपीआई रिक्वेस्ट बनेगी विच विल गो टू द बैक एंड एंड वहां पे ये प्रोसेसिंग होने के बाद आपके पास रिस्पॉन्स आएगा. एंड देखो यहाँ पे एक चीज और इंटरेस्टिंग है. दिस इज द बॉडी आई हैड सेंट एंड दिस इज द रिस्पॉन्स दैट आई हैव गॉट फ्रॉम सर्वर विद ऑल द एडिशनल प्लेस होल्डर्स एंड स्कीमा जो हमने वहां पे पढ़ा हुआ था. ठीक है. Important thing जो I want to show you is, when you are doing API testing, it's very important you get access to the database and check results against that. Why? Let me tell you that also. At times there will be scenarios where there will be thousands of records that exist. You won't be able to test each and every record, right? But if you have access to the database, you can create scenarios. For example, वहां पे जो नंबर ऑफ यूजर्स आ रहे हैं, क्या वो सारे के सारे यूजर्स आ रहे हैं जो डेटाबेस में एग्जिस्ट करते हैं? हाउ यू कैन डू इज सिंपली रन अ काउंट क्वेरी. फॉर एग्जांपल, सो व्हाट आई हैव डन इज आई हैव कॉन्फ़िगर्ड माय डेटाबेस हियर. If I go and you know if you look at, these are the tables that are available in WordPress. So right now what we need to look at is our users table. So if I go and open a SQL editor and simply write select asterisk from WP users, so what I'll get is my list of users in the database. These are the 3 users I have created, right? So whenever you are doing testing, any kind of testing, it's very important, get access to the database and check the results against it. What are the scenarios you have to specifically look for? For example, वहां पे आपने 50 characters का यूजर नेम भेजा है, बट बैकएंड में सिर्फ 49 कैरेक्टर्स आ रहे हैं, राइट? कभी आपको टेस्टिंग करने में ये भी एक बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग पार्ट है, आप कई बार डेटा क्रिएट नहीं कर सकते. You have to just play around with available test data. In that case also, in database what I can do is I can go and run the queries and see, अच्छा मुझे ना एक पेज पे ये देखना है कि अगर 50 कैरेक्टर्स का वहां पे वर्ड आता है तो वो पेज रेंडर कैसे करता है. सो दोज काइंड ऑफ टेस्ट केसेस you can always play around if you have access to the database.
Thanks for watching, guys. So this was a high level introduction to APIs. More emphasis was on understanding the conceptual part of it. The practical part, I have just kept it brief so that at least you get a exposure of how API testing is done. But in case you want me to get into more details, want a specific topic to be covered, or you want to connect with me personally to understand it better, feel free to leave a comment and I'll be happy to connect. Thank you.